Lord, as always, I thank you for the opportunity to be able to share with your people. I pray that whatever is spoken from the front here builds into the lives of the people that are listening. And not only builds into their lives, but builds into their lives for your glory, for your honour, and for your name's sake. So Lord, as always, any error is mine. All glory, all honour is yours. Amen. Amen. So, we have finished off, you'll be pleased to know, we finished off the wise and foolish virgins. Yes! 4 messages. That was great. That was record time. Wise and foolish virgins, all done. And now we begin to look at the parable of the talents. The parable of the talents. Now, for those serious Bible students amongst you, which I know is all of you here today, for those serious Bible students amongst you, you will realise that this is actually only found in the book of Matthew. But there is another very similar parable, which is also found in the book of Luke. And you're all going, aha, I knew that. So I thought that, how do I actually deal with this then? Do I work through the Matthew account? And then do I eventually, when we get to the Luke one, work through the Luke one? Or do I lay them both out and try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak? And so what I've decided to do is to look at them together. So it's the parable of the talents and the parable of the miners. And that's the M-I-N-A-S, not the men that go down in holes and dig coal out of it, the miners, okay?
Not those who are underage.
Nor those that are under the age of whatever it is, 18, 16, however it works these days. So I'm going to sort of lay them out, not exactly together, but sufficiently close enough to try and allow us to sort of understand both stories, all right? So because the parables are pretty similar in design, potentially they're very similar in meaning, but they're told in totally different settings, totally different contextual settings. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge. So we'll see how we track with this. If it all falls over, then I'll go back to plan A, which will be dealing with them all in one block. But hopefully we'll have a chance to enjoy looking at these two in tandem with each other. So we'll read through the Matthew account first. It's quite a few verses, just warn you, heads up here, it's quite a few verses. And then what we'll do is we'll read through the Luke account. And then what we'll do is we'll draw a few comparisons. And I can see that you are absolutely raring to go already and that you just can't wait to get stuck into this, right? Raring to go. So, I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. It'll all be up there on the screen, but if you want to follow it in your own Bibles, we're going to kick off in Matthew 25, and that's verses 14 through to 30. So Matthew 25, 14 through to 30. 4. It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I've made 5 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I've not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Nice and simple. Nice and simple. I'm sure you will all know what Jesus was getting at as he spoke this to the same bunch of people that he'd just told the story of the wise and foolish virgins to. So you all know what Jesus is getting at. That was a little clue, by the way. That was a little clue. You might want to keep that in mind as we track through this, because he's talking in a very similar vein. He's gone from that parable into this parable. What he said here is going to be relevant to what he's saying here. He's talking in the same vein. He's trying to get folk to understand things in the real world. Right. So, now let's have a look at what Luke has got to say. And that's going to be found in Luke 19, 12 to 27. Luke 19, 12 to 27. He said, therefore, this is Jesus speaking. He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. Calling 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas and said to them, engage in business until I come. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we do not want this man to reign over us. When he returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. The first came before him, saying, Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more. And he said to him, well done, good servant. Because you've been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. And the second came, saying, Lord, your mina has made 5 minas. And he said to him, and you are to be over 5 cities. And then another came, saying, Lord, here is your mina, which I kept laid away in a handkerchief, for I was afraid of you, because you're a severe man. You take what you did not deposit and reap what you did not sow. And he said to him, I will condemn you with your own words, you wicked servant. You knew that I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money in the bank, and at my coming I might have collected it with interest? And he said to those who stood by, take the mina from him, give it to the one who has the 10 minas. And they said to him, Lord, he has 10 minas. I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. But as for these enemies of mine, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Okay, so what I plan to do now is going to take a quick look at a comparison between these two parables. Obviously that you can see that there are some similarities, but you will have noticed through those two stories that there are some significant differences. So to try to show this, what I've done is I've pulled together a small table. I don't know how well it's going to look up here. I've pulled together a small table, lining up just some of the areas that we're likely to touch into. And it sort of looks something like that. Can you read that? Is that readable from where you are? So, and I've sort of laid it out, reason, audience, location, characters, instruction, all of that sort of stuff, just to see how we track. So in Matthew, the reason for this parable was because it was a question that was raised in private. But in the Luke account, the reason that Jesus gave the telling of the parable was because the people around him thought that the kingdom of God would suddenly appear. It was imminent. It was going to happen. And so Jesus then says, let me just tell you this story. The audience in the Matthew account were the disciples. Whether that's the 12 disciples or whether that's many, many more disciples, we don't know. But it was the disciples. In the Luke account, this follows on immediately from Zacchaeus and the big crowd. And so it's a big crowd of people that are following him on his travels. The location in the Matthew account is on the Mount of Olives. This one, in the Luke account, is in the journey between Jericho and Jerusalem. So Jesus is just outside of Jerusalem and he's telling that Luke account. The characters in the Matthew account, well, we've got the man who's travelling to a far country, and we've got the 3 servants. They're the main characters. In the Luke account, we've got a nobleman who's going into a far country in order to receive a kingdom and then return. And then what we've got is we've got citizens who actually hate that nobleman. And then we've got the 10 servants of the nobleman. So we've got a number of different characters there. The instructions that were given in the Matthew account, well, we've got 1, 2, 3 servants who were given 5, 2 and 1 talents to invest. In the Luke account, we've got 10 servants who are each just given 1 mina. When you look at the outcomes of this in the Matthew account, you've got the servant who was given 5, made 10, 2 made 4, 3 made 1. In the Luke account, the servant that was given the 1 mina made 10 more, which to me makes 11 in total, I think. So do check my math on this. The second servant, he had 1 and was made 5, so he ended up with 6. And the third servant had 1 and ended up with 1. In fact, he ended up with 0, ultimately. So the result in the Matthew account is servants 1 and 2 were given a big thumbs up, a big well done, made ruler over many, and they were to enter into the joy of the Lord's rest. The third servant, well, his 1 talent was taken and it was given to servant 1. In Luke, the first servant that we read of was given authority over 10 cities. The second servant was given authority over 5 cities. And the third servant, although it could have been the 7th, 8th or 9th, because we're not actually told what number it was, that last servant that we come to, well, his mina was given to the one who was given the authority over the 10 cities. And so he ended up with nothing and he was chucked out. So the explanation in Matthew is this: everyone who has, more will be given, abundance. He who does not have, even what he has, will be taken. So that's how Matthew sees it. Luke, everyone who has will be given, and the one who does not have, even what he has, will be taken. And then we sort of get to this finale, don't we? So in the Matthew account, the third servant is cast into the outer darkness. And in the Luke account, nothing actually happens to the servant. No. But it's the citizens who hated the nobleman that were slain. Interesting. So that gives us an overview of the similarities and also the differences between these stories. And I hope that one of the things that you're going to pick up on this is not necessarily the final outcome that is the intent of the parable. Not necessarily that. There's an intent that runs through this. And it seems to me that the key factor linking both these parables together is actually all about stewardship. This is actually all about stewardship. It isn't about where you end up at the end of it, but it's about stewardship. That's the intent. Think back to what we were learning from the parable of the virgins and the foolish virgin, the wise and foolish. That was about preparing and not being complacent. And this is about preparing, not being complacent, and stewardship. It tracks on, stewardship. So if the parable of the wise and foolish virgins was about being prepared and not being complacent, this follow-up is actually dealing with the question, what are you doing with what God has given you? What are you doing with what God has given you? So, let's have a look at verse 14. And as I said, we'll focus on Matthew, but I'm going to flick across into Luke as we track. So Matthew 25:14. 4. It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. So what's the 4 that we're talking about? Well, kingdom of heaven, yeah? Kingdom of heaven. Some of your versions may actually have that up front in there. The kingdom of heaven will be like. Some versions have that. They may include that. Others, like the English Standard, don't have it. So, and we draw that back to verse 1 that tells us that this is actually all about the kingdom of heaven. We know the Jewish understanding. I've taught on this a number of times now. We know the Jewish understanding of the kingdom of heaven. The rule, the reign, the sovereignty of God on earth in contrast to the worldly powers in order to present an alternative social reality. Okay? not this place that you head off to when you die. The kingdom of God was this real practical, tangible movement on earth to present an alternative social reality to the worldly powers around them. It was all about getting stuck in the here and now, using what skills you've got, using what talents you've got, your time, your energy, everything that you have to make real-time changes and benefit real living people here, now, today. Okay? And Jesus goes on to say that the outcome is like the man who goes on a journey and entrusts his servants with his property. Goes on a journey and entrusts his servants. I think that's amazing, personally. Going away for a protracted period of time, entrusting your home, your assets, all of your wealth to your servants. I would struggle to have been entrust all of that to my kids, let alone my servants, you know. In fact, I'd probably rather not entrust it to my kids. But I'd come back, I have absolutely nothing less. Sold the house, sold the dogs, done something like that. Anyway, but if you think about being there, think about being back in the story. Every time that you open these pages of scripture, think yourself back into it. Is it Jumanji, that film about the game where you go into the game? Yeah? When you open the scriptures, think of it as the Jumanji. You know, that you get into it, place yourself right back in there. Jesus is there, he's with his disciples, he's on the Mount of Olives and they're chatting, they're talking. And who was it that was listening to this with him? I just told you. The disciples. The disciples are there. They're talking to Jesus, or he's talking to them. And Jesus is talking about a master. And he's talking about servants. And if the listeners were to bring this into their world, they're going to be going, who do we liken the master to? Who do you think the disciples would have likened the master to? Sorry? God? Or more pertinent, perhaps Jesus, who sat talking to them right there and then? You know, they're the disciples. So Jesus, they liken the master to their master, Jesus. And that would have meant, who are the servants likened to? Them, the disciples. So now, as they're sat there listening to this story on the Mount of Olives, Jesus is teaching them, they start to find their place in the story. Because it's starting to get good now. They're beginning to settle down and the expectation starts to rise. They're listening to Jesus unfold this lovely story. And it tracks really similar in the Luke account. But if anything, in the Luke account, the tension would have been wrapped up a bit higher. Because Luke 19, 12, 13 says this. He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return, calling 10 of his servants. So it's not just a man in this story, but it's a nobleman. And he wasn't just heading on a journey, but he's actually going on a journey to receive a kingdom with a clear intent of returning. So, I can see you're all excited. You see, this is where we need to try and understand perhaps the way that this would have resonated with the listeners. Because rhetorical question. What do we think of when we read that? Does it really resonate with anything in us? Probably not really. We can picture, we think of a nobleman, somebody in finery, riding off somewhere and coming back. But there's a real life situation that was going on here at the time of Jesus, or before the time of Jesus, that this could well have been alluding to. He notes, doesn't he, that there's a nobleman who's going off to receive a kingdom and then to return. Well, in around 40 BC, Herod the Great made a trip to Rome. 40 BC, Herod the Great made a trip to Rome in order to get a blessing for his coronation of king of Judea. 3 years later, in 37 BC, he was able to roll into Judea with Roman support and claim his kingdom. So we start to see that in the Herodian dynasty. And then some years later, in about 4 BC, a similar trip was made by the son of Herod. And his name was Archelaus. He also made a visit to Rome in order to seek the kingdom of his father, Herod the Great, when Herod died. And all this backstory would begin to unfold in the way that the narrative was being received by the listeners of the gospel. Oh, a nobleman going out to receive a kingdom. Oh, that sounds like Herod the Great. That sounds like Archelaus. Oh, beginning to start to get a bit of contextual understanding to it. So, back to Matthew, and we see how the money is dished out. So Matthew 25:15, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. So the talents, they've started to be dished out. And we read that and you go, shoom, straight over our heads. I think it does. You read it and go, shoom, yeah, talents dished out, thanks very much, move on swiftly. Nothing to see here. But let's get a quick handle on what we actually mean in the monetary terms here. When we today talk of talents, we tend to mean someone who's gifted, someone who has got a particular skill, how skilled they are at doing something. The dictionary definition of it is a natural aptitude or a skill. And so we read talents. And I can guarantee you, I would put money on it, if I were a gambling man, that there will be many good Christians who, when they read talents, will be thinking exactly that. Skill, aptitude, gifts. They'll be thinking that's what Jesus is talking to. But back in Jesus' day, a talent was a weight or a unit of currency. So as a weight, it was about 36 kg. As a unit of currency, it was 60 shekels. And shekel actually just means weight. So 60 of those pieces made that weight. So 60 shekels. And 60 shekels equaled a mina. You might want to remember that for the parable in Luke. So 60 shekels equaled a mina. A mina was 100 denarii. 100 denarii. That's 100 days of paid work. So you're looking at 3 to 4 months of paid work as a mina. And 60 minas was a talent. And 1 talent was about 6,000 denarii. So just think about that for a moment. 6,000 denarii for 1 talent. That was when 1 denarius was the usual amount given for a day's labour. So this means that using this calculation, a talent at 1 denarius a day would equate to 6,000 days of paid work. 6,000 days of paid work. Roughly 16 years of work. In US dollar terms, that was roughly 600,000 US dollars. 1 talent. 600,000 US dollars. In New Zealand terms, that would be just shy of 860,000 New Zealand dollars. 1 talent. So, this guy dishes out 5 talents to 1 servant, 4.3 million, or about 80 years of work. To the next, he dishes out 2 talents, probably around about 1.72 million New Zealand dollars, 32 years of work. And finally, to the third guy, well, he just gets 1 talent, 860,000 K. You know what? I wouldn't mind somebody just popping 860,000 New Zealand dollars on my desk and saying, there you go, Stevie boy, go invest wisely for me. I'd be going, thank you. 16 years of work. That's probably what I'm supposed to have in me before I retire. Anyway, you look at this and you look at the substantial amounts of money that Jesus is actually referring to. Just think about how Jesus is ratcheting up the storyline here for his listeners. Those listeners will be running through those mental calculations in their head. They'll be going, what? Did I hear that right? Did he really say that amount? And in terms of what that represents as well, as I was working this out, I thought, well, this reminds me of life. It reminds me of life. It's like a snapshot of a timeline of life. From youth, 16 years of work. Midlife, 32 years of work. And finally, a lifetime, 80 years of work. It sort of equates with all of those monetary talents that were passed out. But the sums are absolutely astronomical in terms of what would have landed in the hands of the common labourer. They're just astronomical. You'd never, ever end up with that much money as you're listening to this. Just wouldn't happen. So just these amounts that Jesus is throwing out there in the story would have really caught the listener going, what? Because who are they? The servants. What have they just been given? 4.5 mil. 1.7 mil, 860,000, I'm the servant. Go me. Expectation, right? The Luke account deals with lesser sums of money. Each was given a minor, 60 shekels. Much smaller amounts at play here, but still around 3 to 4 months' wages. Think about what that is worth to you today. Just think about your wage and think about somebody just giving you 3 or 4 months' wages, smack bang. That's a comparative value in terms of the way that they would have seen it back then. Luke 19:13 says this, calling 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas and said to them, engage in business until I come. So he passes out this sum and he instructs his servants to engage in business until he comes. Engage in business until he comes. In the Greek, this means to carry on a business or carry on a business as a banker or trader. And it comes from the Greek word pragma, which specifically relates to business or commercial transactions. In other words, Jesus is saying, keep occupied and make this money work. Make it work. Don't just sit on it. Don't just hoard it. Make it work. I'm giving you this. Make it work. Then look again at what he says in Matthew once the money's been given. Matthew 25:15. Then he went away. The man gave the talents in accordance with the ability of each servant. According to the ability of each servant. You know, he'd got people working for him who he knew. He knew their potential. He knew their gifting. And what he did is he entrusted to each one sufficient so that each one of them that he gave to could reach their potential. Each one of them. And when he looked at that last servant, he didn't think, oh, I'll give him as much as the first. What he did, he knew that the last servant wasn't ready to receive that amount, and he knew that that last servant would probably fail miserably with it. So he gave him the smallest amount. He gave according to the ability. Everything was tailored to meet the capability of the servant receiving. What was given out was tailored to meet the capability of the servant receiving. And doing it this way, that is actually the best way to achieve success. It's the best way to achieve success, or at least give the potential for success. If we were to look at this in our own life, think about what you've been given. Some have been given lots. Some have been given much more than others. Is that fair or unfair? Well, you know what? Perhaps God knows exactly what he's doing, and he's given you what you can handle, with the expectation that there'll one day be a return. I think that we are given sufficient to be able to provide a return, whatever that return may look like, and that return will look different from each one of us. But there's always a choice, right? We can look at what we have been given and we can do absolutely nothing with it. Nothing. We can keep it all wrapped up, all nice and secure, but it's completely ineffective. Or we can invest in things. We can invest in things that not only grow us, but secure a return for the one who actually gave us the gifts in the first place. But there's always a choice. Always a choice. So, our main character, the man in Matthew, he heads away, doesn't he? And he goes off to do what he needs to do. And here we see a bit of a deviation, don't we, from the two accounts. Because in the Matthew account, having dished out the dosh, the man just heads away. Nothing more than that. We read about that in Matthew 15. If we look at the Luke account, we see a bit more action going on, don't we? When the nobleman leaves. Read about it in Luke 19:14. But his citizens hated him. And they sent a delegation after him saying, we don't want this man to reign over us. Basically, the citizens of the area that nobleman oversees, they don't like him. And so they send a delegation out. Well, a delegate is a person who is chosen or elected by a people group in order to speak or vote on that people group's behalf. And so in this case, a number of delegates, i.e. a delegation, was sent to petition the place the nobleman had gone to with the request for that nobleman to be replaced and not put in power over them. So we know that both Herod and his son Archelaus both headed out of the area to be given the keys of the kingdom of Judea by Rome. And I think that all of this would have linked into the thinking of the listeners, as they would have seen that pattern played out since 37 BC with the Herodian family, with Herod's family dynasty. And you know, the Jews had really good reason not to like Herod's family, and particularly Archelaus. In 4 BC, Archelaus slaughtered around 3,000 of them in the temple. Slaughtered around 3,000 in the temple. And he then cancelled Passover. And it was after he did this, he did this rush to Rome to try and placate Caesar. Why did he do that? Because he'd just gone and acted like a ruler when no official title had actually been given to him. No one from Rome, i.e. Caesar, had given him a title for him to be able to carry out the acts that he did in the temple. Someone who could act like that may not only be a threat to their own people, that wouldn't have bothered Rome, but they could have been a threat to Caesar. That would have bothered Rome. Kill your own people, well, that's one thing. But be considered a threat to Rome, well, that just wasn't on, was it? Rome was all about the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. It is something, it didn't matter who you were, what you did, you just had to stay under the peace of Rome, and enforced peace. And so when he did turn up in Rome, this is Archelaus, he was looking to try and take the kingdom from his deceased father, Herod the Great. He got there and he was opposed by his brother Antipas, because Antipas had just been deposed in the will when he'd been removed from the will just days before Herod died. He was also opposed by many Jews who sought to get this man taken away from Judea. They didn't want him to rule over them. They feared him because he had a real cruel streak in him. But Caesar Augustus, being Caesar, went, well, yeah, that's fair enough. Let's give him the bulk of the kingdom. So what he did was he gave him Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. Didn't make him king, but he made him an ethnarch. An ethnarch is a ruler over an ethnic grouping. But the Jews were right to have been concerned about him, because during his reign, Archelaus' reign, he continued to violate all of the Mosaic law. He continued with his massive acts of cruelty. And basically, as a result of the turmoil that he caused, a number of more delegates went back to Caesar Augustus and said, dude, you've got to get rid of this guy. He's a nightmare for us. And so 10 years into his reign, what goes around comes around. And in AD 6 AD, Archelaus was actually deposed and he was banished to Gaul, to a place called Vienne in Gaul. This meant that his kingdom, the kingdom that had been given to him, Samaria, Judea and Idumea, was now replaced by direct Roman rule. And those three then became known as the Roman province of Judea. I can see that you're wrapped with all of this history, but this is really important when you open the Bible. Jesus was talking to real people in real life situations. This was real stuff that was going on. This was real background that they were struggling with. They'd seen this horrendous family come in. They'd seen this kingdom being given. They'd gone out, received the kingdom, and then returned. And so the action of the citizens discussed in this parable that Luke is now looking at and telling us of is seen as a parallel for the response given by the Judeans in regard to Archelaus. So, which for the rest of the parable means that consistently going to have represented the citizens in the Lucan parable as the Jewish folk in the Roman province of Judea. The citizens in the Luke parable are paralleled with the Jewish folk in the Roman province of Judea. Think about how the story ends. This was the area that Jesus was then walking, talking and teaching. And as we track, this understanding of the identity of those citizens impacts the story as it unfolds. But flip back to Matthew 25:16. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. No messing around, right? This first servant does exactly what the master had expected. He knew his abilities, and straight away, that servant, he's straight in there. He gets to work in order to make his money work. The money that he'd been entrusted with, and when he does, it reaps dividend. He started out with 5 talents, 4.3 million, equivalent of 80 years of work. He now sat with 10 talents, 48.6 million New Zealand dollars.
That's not double.
5 talents.
5 talents.
I did say check my maths.
8.6.
8.6, not 48.
There you go, 8.6. I probably transposed it. So there we go. Thank you for checking my maths. I did ask you to. He put his money to work, he traded, so he doubled his initial investment, okay? Irrespective if the slide's wrong. That's not a bad return, is it? Not a bad return at all. He made his money work. In the Gospel of John, it tells us that Jesus was persecuted by the Jews for healing on the Sabbath. His response to them was found in John 5:17. But Jesus answered, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This is the same Greek word. Making the money work, engage in business, is the same Greek word that Jesus uses when he's talking about working. Jesus was cracking on with his job in order to get the best possible return for what had been entrusted to him. He was working. Jesus was trading. He was looking to get significant growth in the investment that he was looking to put out. Matthew continues in verse 17. So also he had 2 talents, made 2 talents more. So the second servant, he also goes straight out to work, gets stuck back in, makes the most of his abilities, and he manages to double his money. Check my maths. So he was given 1.72 million, 32 years of work, and he doubled it. Am I right? 3.44? Haven't got the numbers round the wrong way? Good. So he manages to double it. What a remarkable achievement. What a remarkable achievement. 64 years of salary. Man, that's amazing. Doubling your money. 3.44 million equivalent New Zealand dollars. Things are going great, right? These guys are working hard. They're going to the markets. They're trading. They're working hard. They're doing so well. And the disciples listening, who see themselves in the story, are going, oh yeah, I'm pretty cool. Yeah, I've made some good money. I'm doing well here. They see themselves in the story. They must have been feeling pretty good about themselves. But then we get to verse 18, don't we? But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. He did what? You can imagine the disciples going, hey, oh no, he did what? He did what? They dug a hole, put it in the money. Surely not. You don't just go and dig a hole in the ground and hide the money. You don't do that. I bet that was you, Peter. I bet it was you that did that. I bet that's you who he's referring to. Well, it wasn't me. It was probably John. John's a stupid one. He's the one who has all these visions. You know? Probably hid it in the ground thinking it was going to grow into a money tree or something. It would have taken less effort to actually pop along to the bank, put it over the counter, stick it in a low interest rate, than get a spade, dig a hole and bury it all. Much less effort. But no, this guy, even if his intentions were right, his actions didn't stack up, right? So by burying what he has now been given, he would have absolutely nothing to show. His actions led to the prospect of any interest, even if minuscule, would never ever happen. Why was this? Why was this? The master saw his ability. The master saw his potential. The master gave him sufficient to do something with. So it certainly wasn't the fault of the master. What this comes down to is the view that the third servant held of that master. Not what he did or didn't do with the money, but it was the view that that third servant held of the master. His view was skewed. His view was based on a failure to understand the true nature of the boss that he served. He knew one side of his boss. But what he failed to do is he failed to grasp the other side. The side that gave according to ability and the side that rewarded effort. You see, all the servants, didn't they? They all had the best intentions. But how they acted was determined by their view of who the boss was. Who was he? having good intentions alone will often miss the point. And to me, that seems like a suitable place to pause and ask the question that we opened with. What are you doing with what God has given you? What are you doing with what God has given you? And perhaps to ask an additional question. What is the view of God that motivates you? What is the view that you hold of God that motivates you? Is he the harsh taskmaster who will beat, judge and condemn you to hell for failing him? Or is he the master who recognises your abilities, gives you giftings commensurate with your abilities, and seeks to see you use it for his glory? How you hold God in view is actually going to determine how you live your life and how you use your time that he has given you. You see, the servants in the Matthew story who doubled their master's income were those who were willing to risk it all in the first place. They were willing to risk it all in the first place. Their view of their master was such that they knew even if they lost it all, at least they'd tried. At least they'd tried. And in trying, the master would have been pleased. The final servant didn't even try. He wouldn't risk. And he wouldn't risk because ultimately he didn't trust. Corrie ten Boom, a lady who I know you all know of, a detainee at Ravensbrück concentration camp during the Second World War, author of that great book, The Hiding Place, writes this: "Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. The key is in knowing him. Knowing him." Of the three servants in this Matthew account, only two that risked actually knew their master. The one that sat on what he'd been given actually demonstrated his lack of knowing the master. You see, some of you are extremely talented in certain areas. How are you using those talents that he's gifted you with, that he's entrusted you with, for his glory? How are you doing with that? Are you willing to take risks for God based on your view of God? Are you willing to take risks for God based on your view of God? You won't if you don't trust him, because no one will take a risk on someone that they don't trust. And if you are afraid to trust, it poses the question, how well do you really know him? How well do you really know him? Oswald Chambers writes this: "Faith is unutterable trust in God, trust which never dreams that he will not stand by us." Faith is unutterable trust in God, trust which never dreams that he will not stand by us. What are you being called to do today? How are you being challenged to step out in faith? What are you actually placing your trust in? We see the outcomes being shaped in the initial response of these three servants. If you want to reap the rewards for him, you must be willing to take a step, and you must be really willing to risk for him. That's where we're going to finish today. And we will crack on and continue with it next time round, and I'll review the figures. Let's just pray. Lord, each one of us needs to grow our sense of trust in you. Each one of us do. I know I do. And I pray, Lord, that your people, that those that are called by your name and those that have been entrusted with the great talents according to their abilities, I pray, Lord, that they will double, they will triple, they will quadruple and provide you with a return that well pleases you in their own lives. Each one of us needs to grow and mature, Lord, in our view of who you are. And I pray that as we walk closer with you, Jesus, we would develop a greater sense of trust in your unchanging character, your nature, so that nothing would bring us to a place of inactivity. May we also recognise our place in this story, Lord, so that we can take stock of what you've given us in order to use it wisely, to invest it wisely, so that the multiplication will be there for your glory and for your name's sake. And in your name we pray. Amen.